Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. Today is Monday, May 20th, and we are going to be recapping all of the NBA playoff action from this past weekend. We saw the final results of 3 different series that we're going to be diving into. We're going to be starting out here with the Timberwolves Game 7 win. We are going to be following that up with the Pacers win over the Knicks as well. We're going to be talking some offseason outlooks for the Knicks and the Nuggets. The Dallas Mavericks won on Saturday as well. And briefly at the end here, I want to talk about this sort of future generation of NBA stars as the reigning champs are now out. And we are going to see one of these promising young players win their first NBA Finals officially now. So talking about the changing of the guard a little bit. But before we get into the show today, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. For our live viewers, be sure to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on the latest happenings in sports. Make this show as interactive as possible. And if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker. That is GSMC Podcast. Anything would be greatly appreciated. You can help become a bigger part of the production here. You'll have your comment pop up on screen as well. So without further ado here, getting into our first segment of the day, we are going to be talking about the Minnesota Timberwolves pulling off this historic comeback in order to storm back and beat the Nuggets on their home court in this Game 7 matchup. The Wolves were down by 15 points at halftime, and things even got a little bit worse coming out in that third quarter, where the Nuggets were able to, again, we saw a real shift in how good the defenses were from the first half to the second half, where it seemed like the Nuggets had just fully figured out how to play against the Timberwolves. They were throwing absolutely everything at Anthony Edwards and really limiting them there, and then all of a sudden the script sort of just flipped on its head, and it was the Timberwolves taking over in the second half. And like I mentioned, this became the biggest comeback in Game 7 history in the NBA. And what was most surprising about this was the fact that the Timberwolves were able to do so without Anthony Edwards really having all that great of a game. He finished with 16 points, with 6 of 24 from the field, 2 of 10 from 3. This was, percentage-wise, plus the volume, the worst shooting performance of his young postseason career so far, for whatever that means. He had just 4 points at halftime, and then in the third quarters, really when he started to get himself going, he had some bigger shots down the stretch of this game, including the corner 3 with a couple minutes left. That put the Timberwolves up by 10, but I do think that Anthony Edwards still was able to have an impact on this game, even outside of his scoring. We saw, similar to what we saw in the previous games here, the Denver Nuggets were just willing to entirely sell out their defense to stop Anthony Edwards and have the others hurt them. And for the majority of the first half, that was a very successful strategy because nobody else was really stepping up much for the Timberwolves. They scored just 38 points at halftime, and a lot of people, when they got to that halftime, were arguing that Rudy Gobert had the ball in his hands too much, which I can't say I fully disagree with. I think there was some unwarranted slander of Rudy Gobert during this game, which we'll get to later in this show here, but I thought that it was just a really good job of forcing the ball out of the hands of Anthony Edwards and into others. It was really interesting, I thought, sort of the way that Denver went about double teaming Anthony Edwards, where it seemed like they would send that extra body at him, and when he sort of froze and was looking around, they kept those two bodies there as opposed to forcing him to pick up his dribble and then making sure that you get back in your rotation so that nobody's open. I think that this partially had to do, as much as we're going to be praising Anthony Edwards for this incredible postseason run, I think that that is one thing that teams can probably get away with now while Edwards is still sort of developing into this go-to star in terms of his ability to process double teams as they come. So something I was just a little bit curious to see whether or not we'll see that sort of patience on the defensive end from his opponents through the rest of this playoff run. But ultimately, his teammates just weren't converting in the first half, and I was at times hoping that Edwards would be a little bit more aggressive. Now, it's always sort of weird to balance making the right plays while also understanding as a star player you have to take over at certain times. And really, the most frustrated I was with Anthony Edwards was there were a couple opportunities in transition that he was just deferring. And again, I can't necessarily say that from a pure basketball standpoint it was the wrong decision, but he was just giving up these opportunities in transition when the half court was not going in his favor. He gave it up to Mike Conley after a steal of his own, who ended up getting blocked. That was right before half. And then there was another really sloppy possession in the second half as well, where in transition he gave it off to Rudy Gobert. And again, maybe it was the right pass in a, X's and O's situation, but understanding you are Anthony Edwards, you need to help ignite this team. Why are you deferring so much? So I definitely would not say Anthony Edwards was bad by any means. I think he is at this point of superstardom that we see, and we talked about this. It was during one of the games in that Phoenix series. It was game 2 or 3 where Edwards, his scoring wasn't necessarily there, but he is at a point where he's able to impact a game beyond just scoring points. And, that was really encouraging to see. Now, again, the unselfishness with him led to him being able to dish out 7 assists as well. I think that it worked out in this game, but at the same time, if things didn't play out for the Timberwolves in this, I think he would maybe be set up for a little bit more criticism, but we're not going to go down that path right now because this is a really exciting moment in the history of the Timberwolves franchise that hasn't necessarily had a lot of moments like this. There was a very funny post-game press conference moment between Anthony Edwards and Karl Anthony Towns. A reporter had asked them about what it was of them not losing in this big moment. The, cliche, I don't know if you want to call it a cliche, but the idea that young teams need to suffer big postseason losses before they're ready. And Karl Anthony Towns and Anthony Edwards were just joking, losing a big moment. We lost in the playoffs last year. How much do you want us to lose? We're the Timberwolves. We've lost for the past 20 years. So it was just very funny there. A super charismatic team that you just can't help but root for. And I think that it's really exciting that they are continuing on. It's kind of a shame that the Nuggets are out as early as they are, and I know that for a lot of people they have sort of fallen out of favor, but at the same time, the Nuggets are undoubtedly a top 3 team in the league. I still feel like they are closer to top 2, and Timberwolves end up winning this game, so you have to give them the benefit of the doubt, but I'm not going to retroactively knock the Nuggets. I still think they're great. We're going to get into their flaws later in this show, but as for Minnesota, in this game, the way that their defense was once again able to take it to that next level in the second half. We saw it with the third quarter. Like I mentioned, Nuggets came out to a hot start in that period, and it was really once Minnesota called a timeout, they were trying to challenge a Karl Anthony Towns foul. It was unsuccessful, so they ended up losing that battle, but at the same time it gave them a second to breathe, and from there it seemed like the Timberwolves were just taking over down the stretch of this game. In the first half, we saw the Nuggets doing a really tremendous job of getting on the offensive glass and dominating there. Jokic had 5 offensive rebounds in the first half himself, and then we saw the physical toll that it was taking on Jokic throughout this game. He played every minute except for one. Again, an idea that we will sort of get into later in this show, but like I mentioned, a lot of people were down on Gobert. I thought that he was still very impactful for them, being able to be that sort of roaming defender. And Draymond Green, as much as he would like to clown Rudy Gobert for not being the primary defender on Jokic in these games, it was Karl Anthony Towns who was actually doing the majority of the work there. Draymond knows better than that. He just has his own agenda to push. But in 2016, when Andre Iguodala came off of the bench to become the primary defender on LeBron James, it was the right decision because it allows Draymond Green to do more. He's not restricted to this one particular matchup. And I thought that was very similar for Gobert. And on the offensive side, like I mentioned, it seemed like the ball was in his hands maybe a little bit too much, but I thought that he did do a good job of being aggressive in moments from somebody we don't necessarily view as an offensive player like that, he was drawing a ton of fouls because he was, when he had a smaller man on him, going to be aggressive, and he was drawing these fouls. And because of that, we saw the Timberwolves sort of living in the bonus for what felt like the majority of this game. And I credit that to Gobert because he forced the Nuggets' hand in these instances, and he was actually able to convert on his free throw attempts as well, which is something that, again, could have gone sideways if he wasn't able to knock them down. But he finishes this game going 7 of 9 from the free throw line. So I thought Gobert was great in this. This was definitely sort of a testing point coming off of his 4th Defensive Player of the Year award. Him being able to sort of step up in this big moment. And again, it's not like he was the primary defender on Jokic, but when you look at that defensive end, his presence was deterring Jokic from even trying the Karl Anthony Towns post up because he knew if he beats one level, he has this all-world defender right behind him as well. And that's why we saw Jokic sort of floating around the three-point line far more than I'm sure he would have preferred to, but they were trying to run that two-man action between him and Jamal Murray, and Minnesota was just staying home in the paint. They had somebody pressed up against Murray in the mid-range, and then they did not respect Jokic from the outside. He missed his first 7 3-point attempts. He ended up 2 of 10 from the night, but from the three-point line on the night as a whole. But again, Minnesota's defense, there is a reason they've gotten as much praise as they have, and I think that Karl Anthony Towns also does deserve a ton of credit in that conversation because, like I mentioned, when he is not fouling and actually is on the court, he is such an impactful player, and even just his size alone, period, does add to this identity of Minnesota where they are able to play so big and they can make an impact sort of taking away the post from a lot of opposing teams' games, which was exactly how you had to stop the Denver Nuggets, and they were able to do so in an excellent way. So give us your thoughts on this series. Ultimately, I think that these were probably, again, 2 of the 3 best teams in the league. The Boston Celtics have a conversation somewhere in that as well. That being said, I don't think the Celtics would have been able to eliminate Nikola Jokic the way that the Timberwolves did. So as a Celtics fan, thank you, Minnesota, for doing that. But again, you have to give just so much credit to this Minnesota team. And something that we're going to sort of be expanding upon later in the show is the fact that the reigning champs are out once again. And this is now going to be the 6th straight year we have a new champion. We haven't had repeat champs. We haven't even seen a defending champion make the conference finals since the Kevin Durant Warriors in 2018. So it is really incredible to see sort of the way that Minnesota was able to handle the Nuggets. And now if you're looking big picture in the NBA, the level of parity is tremendous, which again, stick with us throughout the show and we will touch more on that. But for now, we are going to be taking our first break of the show. And when we come back, we're going to be diving into the Pacers-Knicks series. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, no, this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Now I'm going to be talking about the other Game 7 that we saw yesterday take place between the Indiana Pacers and the New York Knicks, which saw the Pacers pretty handedly do so against the Knicks thanks to an unreal offensive performance. The Pacers put up 130 points to win this game. They had the highest field goal percentage ever at halftime at around 73%, so they were tremendous, and we're going to talk about some of the Knicks part of this equation eventually here, but do want to give credit to the Pacers for stepping up in this moment where we saw them down 3-2 headed into the weekend, and really in large part, this big deal that was made right ahead of the trade deadline in acquiring Pascal Siakam. He is maybe a little bit flawed of a star player. We saw Bilal Coulibaly. If you aren't familiar with him, he was a lottery pick for the Washington Wizards this past season, and he went on some sort of podcast and talked about how Pascal Siakam is actually easy to guard. And again, I do think that he is slightly flawed, but at the same time, he was so incredible in these two games, and specifically, I thought it was the hunting mismatches. This is an idea that we talked about during the Milwaukee series as well, where he just sort of imposes his will at times when he has these smaller defenders on him, and with no OG Anunoby, who did briefly at least show up to the game. He started the game for New York, and it was just clear after the first 5 minutes that he was physically not ready to go. And Pascal again got out to a hot start in this game, sort of forced OG to the bench. And again, the Knicks were just kind of throwing Josh Hart as the primary defender on him, and he just did not have the size. The tough shot making of Siakam really is incredible. So scored 25 points on Friday, 20 points yesterday, and what was a total team contribution in this game. All 5 of their starters scored at least 17 points in this game, and again, just seemed like they could not miss. So for Knicks fans, I'm sure you're feeling that a couple things just go differently, especially when you look to Game 3 and the Andrew Nembhard game winner at the end of that one. If that doesn't fall, feels like, are the Pacers going to be the first team to ever come back from a 3-0 deficit? Feels like the case is probably no, but obviously injuries were just a real factor for the Knicks and continued to stack up for them, and it was sort of fully came into picture here when Jalen Brunson suffered the fractured hand injury in the second half that really put an end to the Knicks season there if they were going to have any type of chance to pull off this type of a win. They were going to need him, and the reality of the situation for the Knicks is that teams just aren't necessarily built to be, a sustainable postseason run based off of the back of one scorer. And again, injuries were just a massive part of this whole thing, and it goes far beyond just Jalen Brunson. Like I mentioned, OG Anunoby felt like when he went down with the hamstring injury, that was sort of when the series really started to shift there. That was at the end of game 2. They end up winning that game, but it just wasn't necessarily the same Knicks defense from there on. Another loss in terms of shot makers helped contribute to them have to go a bunch of different directions with the starting lineups that they were playing with all throughout this series. But Isaiah Hartenstein was dealing with injuries. Mitchell Robinson, he obviously was ruled out. Bogdanovich, you can just go down the list. They were dealt a lot of tough cards, and again, we'll get more into the Knicks conversation in terms of long-term, what this looks like for them in the next segment. But I want to stick a little bit more on the Pacers side of this for now, where inherently a lot of people are going to come for the Pacers, talk about how fortunate they are to be in this position, facing off against a Bucks team that was out without Giannis and Damian Lillard for 2 games, now having this matchup against the New York Knicks. But the reality of the NBA is that injuries are always a part of postseason runs. And for the Pacers, give them credit. They are a deep team. They've been a deep team all season long. That was the number one factor, I thought, coming into this series. And I'm kicking myself a little bit because I had that gut feeling about the Pacers throughout this series, but I was just never able to fully pull the trigger. Maybe in part because I didn't want to how sensitive Knicks fans can be at times. I didn't want to ruffle too many feathers, maybe. I don't know. But the discrepancy in the benches were a massive part of this. And we just saw when it was that late first quarter, late third quarter, all throughout this series, it was TJ McConnell and Obi Toppin coming in. Isaiah Jackson provided tremendous minutes for the Pacers in this series. And the Knicks just really weren't able to keep up on the other end, where, I mean, in this game, it was ridiculous performances from TJ McConnell. Ben Shepherd, who has also been a really nice bench piece for the Pacers, he was really feeling himself in this game as well in terms of being a contributor. So a tough one for the Knicks because sometimes, we've talked about it before, the 3-point variance of the NBA can absolutely catch up to you at times. But I do think that, on paper, with all the injuries the Knicks were dealing with, the Pacers are the better team in this situation. And I know that it's definitely going to be a conversation of the teams that made the conference finals in NBA history, as far as the worst, maybe undeserving, you could potentially say, teams to reach the conference finals. I just don't feel like the Pacers have been given their credit all throughout this postseason run, where people said they weren't good against Milwaukee, but I just think that I disagree, where Pascal Siakam was incredible early on there. Their bench has been really good for them throughout this whole playoff run. Now, Tyrese Halliburton is a very interesting conversation because he looks to be this superstar player, but, on the road, headed into this game, he was averaging just 10 shot attempts per game, and that's just, you need more from that from your, centerpiece player, but he at least came to play in this game. Now, granted, he didn't have to be the aggressor early on, so I know a lot of people are running with this whole idea of he's a front runner. I don't necessarily see it that way. I think he sets the table for just about everyone in that offense. Now, I would like to see him be a little bit more aggressive in those crunch time situations when the game is a little bit more contested. But at the same time, you take the wins where they come, and Halliburton in this game was the team's leading scorer, so you have to give him credit for that. And again, this Pacers team as a whole, they've just been sort of this team really ever since the in-season tournament, and I know the second half of the season did not go as planned for them, where a lot of the shine with this team sort of wore off, in large part because Tyrese Halliburton was not the same player. After that, was dealing with all of those injuries as well, but even despite that, averaged something like 19 points per game after the All-Star break, so would have preferred to see more from him, but he still, the Pacers are still kicking here, and I think that they, again, like I was talking about earlier in the segment, that what they did to go out and acquire Pascal Siakam, understanding that no, he's not necessarily the perfect NBA player, but understanding their own situation. They are a young team in a mid-market that isn't going to be able to draw the interest of all these free agents, that you go out, you get a borderline all-NBA player, and you just sort of run with it. And here they are now in the conference finals. We're going to be doing more of the series previews tomorrow, so definitely check back in with us there. They have a tall task ahead of them with the Celtics on the other end of this series. Celtics have been able to rest much longer here in the context of a postseason, but at the same time, Pacers have to be feeling good about themselves, and I still think they are going to continue to develop. They hasn't really been talked about because, again, they are a mid-market team, and there have been plenty of other more notable injuries, but losing Benedict Mathurin was a big loss for them at the time, and I still feel like I don't think that he would be someone that would necessarily swing these series their way when they come into Boston in the conference finals, but a very valuable player for them that they've been able to hang in there without. And it's almost opened the doors a little bit for having some of these other bench players step in and play meaningful minutes for them. Aaron Nesmith may be feeling like there's no pressure behind him in order to, fully succeed. And also in terms of making these mid-season deals, was moving on from Buddy Hield, where they just clearly didn't see eye to eye in terms of what his role should be versus from their perspective versus what he wanted. And again, this is a situation where Shepherd was able to sort of thrive being their sharpshooter off the bench instead, and the future is still very bright for the Pacers. So we'll talk more about what the rest of the playoffs look like for them tomorrow, but for now, I do want to sort of put a little bit of a bow on both the Nuggets and the Knicks, who were eliminated. So stick with us, and we will look ahead to their offseason right after this quick break. So stick with us. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Like we just mentioned, we have the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Indiana Pacers advancing to the conference finals, and I do want to briefly here look at the other side of that equation, where the Nuggets and the Knicks were two of the perceived top teams in their conferences, and they still were ultimately at the top if things were fully healthy, for specifically more so referring to the Knicks in that category. But I wanted to look ahead here about what is next for these teams, because they are hoping to stay in contention over the next handful of years, and this is definitely a disappointing exit for both of them, but there are things that I do think they can do to sort of stay alive. Now, we're going to be starting off with the Knicks here, and I think the first question is, talking about the injury bug here, and they obviously dealt with, we mentioned before, Jalen Brunson was dealing with his foot injury, ultimately the fractured hand, but he wasn't 100% healthy. Then you go down the list, missing Julius Randle since before the playoffs even started. You lose Bogdanovich, you lose Mitchell Robinson fully in these playoffs. Josh Hart was dealing with that ab injury from Game 6 on. OG Anunoby and his hamstring. Everything just seemed to be piling up for the Knicks. And there is definitely a Tom Thibodeau conversation to be had in terms of his usage and the heavy minutes that all of these players are playing. Now, I think it's a little bit subjective talking about some of these injuries because sometimes they're freak injuries, and then sometimes you have instances where these muscle strains can be at times a little bit more wear and tear. I feel like there's something to be said specifically looking at the OG Anunoby minutes where that one never really made all that much sense to me, that they were trying to run with him as much as they could, considering the fact that and obviously OG wasn't in New York for the majority of his career. He's been with Toronto, but he hasn't necessarily been the most reliable player in terms of staying on the court. He's dealt with a handful of injuries over the past couple seasons that it just seemed like you were definitely running a risk with somebody who hasn't necessarily been seen as the most durable player in the NBA. And ultimately, I think that when you look at this whole conversation, on one hand, yes, absolutely, the Knicks were trying to do whatever they could and capitalize on the situation that was at hand. They were in the playoffs. They had a good chance. Things just had to bounce their way and they could potentially make a run. But at the same time, their bench wasn't all that strong. Now, they had Miles McBride, who was somebody they really trusted, and Mitchell Robinson, who was dealing with an injury for the majority of the year before being ruled out once again in the postseason. That we understand their bench depth wasn't very good, frankly, but the Alec Burks conversation is really weird to me because he provided really solid offense, and when the Knicks seemed like they could have potentially had some hope in the second half of this game, it was because Alec Burks was performing at a very high level offensively. He finishes this game with 26 points, and in the first game that he actually got some action in Game 4, I believe it was, or Game 3 really is when he first came into it. He scored 14 then 20, 18, 11, and 26 in this series finale. So I find it strange that Tom Thibodeau didn't believe that there was any room for Alec Burks in the rotation, but at the same time, I mentioned this before, he sees more in-depth stuff. The defensive rotations, it definitely looked like he was a little bit out of whack. Now, you could also argue that maybe that is because of a lack of runtime with this group, but probably stems from Alec Burks has never been all that great of a defender in his career. So this whole Alec Burks tangent has come from the idea of he couldn't have eaten up any of the minutes that Josh Hart was playing heavily throughout this series and throughout the postseason as a whole. Like, I understand they tried to run out, Jericho Sims in a few instances, and that didn't work, and Precious Achiuwa was pretty hit or miss in these instances, so I understand you want to have your best players on the court, but it does sort of, when you look at all the injuries piling up here, and just with the reputation that Thibodeau has now, obviously he does not care what the public perception of him is, but it's just something to sort of consider. And I think that there have been a lot of parallels that people have pointed to the 2017 Celtics run, where it was pretty much Isaiah Thomas, the small guard, just putting up 30 points a game and coming up huge in the fourth quarters to carry this, scrappy, lovable, underachieving team to a postseason run. Now, Knicks obviously don't make the conference finals. I think that, yes, if they were fully healthy, they would have. But from there, nobody was really the same level health-wise, ultimately starting with Isaiah Thomas. and I don't expect there to be that level of a drop-off, but are the Knicks going to be able to look the same after this postseason? Jalen Brunson, so unfortunate that that is the way that this season ends. His shooting hand getting fractured, going to take him out for some of the offseason as well. Now, ultimately, I think that he'll be fine. I think that Josh Hart can recover fine as well. OG Anunoby, all of these guys. But after, seeing all of this build up in one season and being a very physically taxing run, I am curious. It's going to be a storyline headed into next year. And once you can chalk it up as freak injuries, we'll see how they are able to sort of run this back next year, but is going to be very interesting. Now, I don't think that they're going to run it back with the exact same roster. I do expect them to try and be active to find a second guy because, like I mentioned, the reason why they were relying so heavily on their starting lineups was because of the fact that Jalen Brunson was really your only creator from an offensive perspective. And yes, Julius Randle can do so, but at times it feels like it's a coin flip as to whether or not you're going to get a bought-in, efficient version of Randle. And I think that for a lot of Knicks fans, the consensus is that it would be okay for them to move on. But move on for what is the question. Now, Donovan Mitchell has been a name that's been thrown out there for a while. I think that to some degree as well, it's an idea, but excuse me. It's an idea, but I think he plays very similar to Jalen Brunson. Neither one of them provide very much on the defensive side of the ball. So I don't really like the fit there, ultimately. I understand you want to go out and get the star power, but I don't think that that is the angle you really want to go at. Now, I feel like a lot of people aren't going to like this. I feel like Paul George would be probably, or at least a player like Paul George. I don't think there are that many options out there on the market, but I do think that, they need some sort of a forward, I think, that can help can play some defense as well. A sneaky candidate would probably, for me, be DeMar DeRozan. Now, I understand he doesn't space as much. Knicks probably want a little bit more three-point shooting in this, but if they can pick up, a 2-3, like a shooting guard, small forward, somewhere around that, they can play maybe a little bit bigger, or they could maybe run OG Anunoby at the 4 and have a, Josh Hart or Dante DiVincenzo in a starting lineup with one of those other guys. I just think they need somebody who can they can fully trust on both sides of the ball. And when Jalen Brunson is being extremely, physically taxed with carrying the offense, he can have somebody he can rely on more to make a shot off the dribble, generate a look for himself or the team. And I think that, again, Paul George, DeMar DeRozan would be two of the free agents that I would definitely be looking to. Again, I understand they're maybe not the superstar level that has been talked about in New York for a while, but I think the Knicks are pretty close here. I thought that OG Anunoby, again, I didn't love how much they ran him up this season because of the durability with him, but I think that he is a perfect, third best player on a championship roster, that they can sort of work him into the system more, have him be a little bit more of a catch and shoot option, and ultimately, I think that the Knicks can definitely be back in this conversation next year if fully healthy, but they are going to, if they want to elevate their ceiling to championship levels, need to have somebody else who can go out and get them a bucket. Now, if you're a Knicks fan and you are on the Julius Randle sort of hype train, he may be your guy, but at the same time, I just don't know if I necessarily would want to put all my eggs in that basket, where it seems like the window is sort of now the East should be in a healthy version of the conference, should be better next year, and that goes for the Knicks as well, but I just don't know if I would necessarily want to go down that road. Now, talked a lot of Knicks here. I do have to get a little bit of Nuggets talk in as well. think that one of the main things for them is the fact that they had no bench really whatsoever. Christian Braun was really impactful for them, but from more of a defensive standpoint. Justin Holiday, I also thought played good defense in this series, but they really didn't have a scorer off the bench. Now, could that be one of their younger players developing? That's sort of been their plan. A Julian Strother, a Hunter Tyson. Could one of them end up stepping up and being a scoring guy off the bench? Kind of interesting to think about. Well, could Bones Highland have been that type of an option? They sold him off for just about nothing during the trade deadline last year. But they're going to need a bench scorer, and they need to be able to hit three-pointers at a higher clip. They were bottom 6 during the regular season in terms of three-pointers made. Now, that just has to be better, and it's going to be really interesting to see what the future of Michael Porter Jr. looks like in Denver, because the fact that he was basically being replaced by Christian Braun in this series for a lot of the impactful minutes, the closing minutes in a couple of these games, because of the fact that MPJ just did not have it offensively. He scored 25 total points in the final 4 games of this series. He was 4 of 21 from 3. That's supposed to be your go-to guy to be able to, you swing it to him, he is able to knock that shot down. And that was just no longer the case. Now, he was great against the Lakers, so I definitely don't want to overreact. But I think that that will be a conversation, because in terms of a player that's maybe a little bit more expendable, that does have value for them, I think it's Michael Porter Jr. But let me know what you think in the comments section. Getting a backup big man is also very important for the Nuggets this offseason, because like we saw, they never really had a true option. Zeke Naji, I think, was their other technical center or big man that was on the roster, and he was not an option for them in this series. And I just feel like, Aaron Gordon, he's a good player, but especially understanding that Minnesota isn't going anywhere, they're going to need to add a little bit more size. But let me know what your thoughts are, what your favorite fits would be for some free agents, some potential stars on the move for either one of these teams. We're now, though, going to be talking about the other series that wrapped up over the weekend, and that is the Dallas Mavericks beating the Oklahoma City Thunder on Saturday in their Game 6 matchup, and the Mavericks will be advancing to face the Timberwolves in the conference finals. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're now going to be talking about Saturday's Mavericks win, where they were able to take down the Oklahoma City Thunder in a thrilling matchup, 117-116, in order for the Mavs to officially move on to the conference finals. This is a team that made some moves at the trade deadline. I talked about it. They were definitely buying in for a team that can win this year, but they're going to need to capitalize on this new window for them, and they are absolutely doing so. It seems like they have put together the perfect type of team for Luka Doncic in order to succeed, where it's not so much of a one-man show for Dallas anymore, and they have other supplementary help. Now, in this game, at least, it was Luka doing a lot of the heavy lifting. He was the leading scorer for them. That's not something necessarily out of the ordinary, but it's some of these role players and the, physicality that they bring. Derek Lively, we're going to be talking about how impactful he has been. And, you think about Dallas, and what I was sort of, worried about for them was, well, if they were going to match up against a Nuggets team, I don't know if they necessarily have the size to be able to do so. And for Dallas in this game, they were the ones who were playing bigger. And now that also sort of stems to the Oklahoma City part of this equation, where it seems like they absolutely do need another center. I believe that between Chet Holmgren and Jalen Williams, they had something like 10 rebounds combined over Jalen Williams, the center version, of course, from Arkansas. Something like 10 rebounds combined in games 5 and 6. So that is definitely a real problem for Oklahoma City that I'm sure they're going to be addressing during the offseason. And, you know, they had a chance to. We've talked about it before. Daniel Gafford was on the open market, but it was the Mavericks who went to go get him. He and Lively were both just, again, at any given moment, one of them can be an interior threat. And Lively with 15 rebounds, believe the youngest player to ever grab 15 rebounds in a playoff game. So he was awesome for them. And the Mavericks, again, it's this sort of duality of them where I do think that their defense is really impressive, specifically at guarding the paint, despite maybe not necessarily having a true defensive anchor necessarily. And again, the two-man punch of Gafford and Lively is definitely really impactful for them. But at the same time, you know, who was going to be the primary matchup against Jokic? I don't know if they necessarily would have had an option. And it's still going to be a little bit of a similar conversation heading into next round, because Minnesota definitely has size with Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns. Now, neither one of them quite as dominant as Jokic, but still going to be a conversation for sure, I would say. But the fact that they can also turn it on offensively, that's sort of what they are at their core, is a scoring team. And they were able to sort of out-offense the Thunder in this game, where it felt like a lot of this series, truthfully, was sort of about the, you know, who was able to hit more threes, because Oklahoma City was very inconsistent, I thought, from the three-point line in this series. And the Mavericks were able to take advantage because of the fact that their paint defense is as strong as it is, to sort of force OKC into outside shots. And if they weren't falling, they didn't necessarily have the offense necessary to capitalize. But for Dallas, you know, it is having these other role players that Luka specifically can sort of rely on and trust down the stretch of these games, that he doesn't have to do everything by himself. Like I mentioned, Lively, some really timely rebounds in this game. Got himself to the free throw line by being that interior force, so he was incredible for them. PJ Washington was basically cold the entire night. He was dealing with some foul trouble, but he was able to get himself going down the stretch of this game, where I have the exact numbers here. PJ Washington was scoreless for the first 43 minutes of this game, and then he had 9 points in the final 5 minutes to help close this out. He had the free throws at the end that I know were controversial to a lot of people. If you watch the broadcast, they did an excellent job of explaining the foul call. Now, for those of you who maybe didn't get to see, it was Luka backing down Lou Dort. He loses the ball and just sort of flips it out to Washington with the shot clock winding down. PJ gave a pump fake, pulled up, and drawed a foul with 2.5 seconds left. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander jumped up, and he did initially make contact with the ball, but PJ Washington was able to, you know, hold it in place. He hadn't yet released it. And then as he was still sort of rising, Shai fell down and was sort of still grabbing onto his arm on the way down, and that was called a foul because of the fact that PJ didn't release it at the time that Shai made contact with the ball. I thought the ref did a really good job of sort of explaining it. It was almost, you know, he made a clean play before the shot. Then by the time PJ actually shot it, it was a foul. So I didn't think it was all that controversial, but a lot of people were upset about it. Let me know what you think in the comments section, but I kind of thought it was a no-brainer. And I was hoping to see this series extend, because I think that, you know, out of these competitive series, this has been the one that was actually good games, pretty much every single one, where we saw a lot of blowouts between Indiana, New York, and between Denver and Minnesota. For the most part, these were all great games, so I wasn't ready to necessarily, give up on it. And again, the ending was a ton of fun, but I was nowhere near as upset about the call as a lot of other people were. But OKC, they have a ton to look forward to still. Their future core is extremely well-rounded. Now, again, the rebounding and being big is a little bit of an issue for them. Now, it's not that Chet's a really good player, obviously, and I don't want to slander him by any means. He was able to himself as well sort of take advantage of certain instances where, with his size, if they didn't have Derek Lively on him, you saw with, about a minute or so left, Shea got Derek Lively switched onto him on the perimeter, and once he beat Lively off the dribble, he threw the lob up to Chet in a very crucial situation. So it's not that Chet, again, isn't a factor, but need more of a dominance, I think, from him, at least in terms of rebounding alone would probably be, a big-time difference maker for them. But he was just getting beat. We saw Lively go right over him with a couple minutes left. I think it was on his 15th rebound where he just sort of extended out right over Chet, ended up drawing a foul, and then right after that, he ends up missing his second free throw, and it was PJ Washington grabbing another key offensive rebound that ended up leading to him knocking down a three as well. So it just seems like in these big moments, the Thunder were unable to rebound, and that's why they had the other Jalen Williams playing these closing minutes. And again, you can see the youth with them, even from a coaching perspective, and Mark Dagnall, who is a young coach. They were playing with a different fifth closer every single game. It went from Giddey to Isaiah Joe. Cason Wallace got some action. In this game, they ran with Jalen Williams to help close out this game, and yet I thought that it was mostly to try and help on the rebounding front, but it wasn't very effective as, again, like I mentioned, the Mavericks were able to get these big boards that were ultimately able to put them over the edge. So, I think that the Thunder, it's very clear that Josh Giddey is going to be heading elsewhere this offseason. Now, like I mentioned, I sort of just threw it out on a whim, the idea of him going to the Spurs. I feel like I like that even more as it sort of resonates with me longer. There are other teams that he could be thrown into as well. I think if you're Washington, why wouldn't you take a swing on him? You need so many different pieces. If he can be, we've seen him in his own offense be able to be a much more effective player when he's on the ball more, creating for others and sort of working from there. So I don't think that Giddey is, a fully broken piece, but I think that he's going to be the trade chip for them as they try and go out and get a more, definitive playmaker for them. Or I shouldn't say playmaker, because Giddey is the, passing playmaker, but they're going to need a more established star is what I should say, and definitely some size as well. But Mavericks are moving on here. They've been one of the most fun teams this whole second half of the season, and going to be fun to see what Luka looks like here. I know that he's dealing with these injuries. I mean, even still in this game, it's just so... The referee conversation is just always so prominent with him, and it's all the announcers could really talk about with him is that he was, getting himself in these conversations. He had a technical called on him in the first half. He and Tony Brothers, I think it was, or it was Scott Foster, I'm sort of blanking. It was Tony Brothers, were, talking at length, and it seemed like Luka was going to get himself thrown out at some points of this game, but ultimately he was able to stick in there and help the Mavericks win this game. But Let me know what your thoughts were in the comment section. We're now going to be taking our final break of the show, and when we come back on the other side, I want to talk about this Final Four remaining and all of the youth talent and the lack of veterans, to say the least, in these conference final series. So stick with us, and we will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day. I just wanted to sort of talk about this playoff picture as a whole now, and looking at the remaining teams, we are going to have a new champion. We're going to see a new finals MVP, and it's probably going to come from one of these young stars. Each of the 4 teams remaining has an all-star young player, from Jason Tatum and the Celtics, Tyrese Halliburton, Luka Doncic, Anthony Edwards, and we're in this new era of the NBA, so I just sort of wanted to talk about what we're looking here in general, because all of the main stars from the 2010s were eliminated headed into round 2. Even before the conference finals, LeBron James, Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, Westbrook, Harden, Anthony Davis, Jimmy Butler. Really, the closest thing to it is Kyrie Irving, who was able to sort of hang around as a second star, which he's obviously still a very impactful piece of this Mavericks team. But if the Mavericks win the finals, I would be shocked if Kyrie won Finals MVP over Luka Doncic, and it's just going to show that this next generation has came out and put on some really key performances in some overall really compelling series, where 3 out of 4 of them went to at least Game 6, plus a couple Game 7 games as well, and it was powered by this sort of youth movement. There are no remaining league MVPs still in the playoffs. Now, I'm not even going to get into the whole, Luka debate. I think that Luka is eventually going to win an MVP, but again, as things currently stand, we are sort of at least looking at a playoffs without any of the prominent figures of the past era. And I think that, the NBA has been sort of soft launching what the next generation is going to look like with a lot of the commercials. Again, I got to look into it, but I think they were doing some type of a show or something about the rising guard and the expectations. I've seen commercials for it at least throughout a handful of these NBA games, and we're at a place now where we're going to see, we've just seen so much parity as the years have gone on here. Like I mentioned earlier in the show, the 2018 Warriors with Kevin Durant are the last team to win a championship and even make it to the conference finals in the next year, where it's just, again, time and time again, we're seeing how difficult it is to have that maintained success. And there was at least conversations with the Nuggets, take with it what you will. I don't really know how to evaluate it. I think it was a different conversation when the Warriors were every single year going on these deep playoff runs. the idea of the Nuggets sort of having the fatigue kick in for them, and that's part of the reason why, because they were playing late into June last year, that's why they were a little bit more exhausted this year. I don't know if I necessarily buy into all of that, but, not to something that I just sort of want to throw out there. I don't mean to kick him when he's down, but I talked about the underperformance of Michael Porter Jr., and obviously everything that's going on with him have to handle with extreme care, but he's had a lot of stuff go on in his personal life lately with his brothers that is just another example of how there are so many things in life that can get in the way of trying to be this dynasty and repeating on a yearly basis. It's just so much goes into it, and then you have the injury conversations as well. If you want to go back to, the Bucks who won in 2021, the next year they came back and they were dealing with the Chris Middleton injury, who was their second best player coming out of that championship, and honestly, not having him, by the end of that, they end up losing to the Celtics in 7 in the second round. So there are just so many other things that get in the way that I feel like the parity is at an all-time high. And as we are seeing all of these different stars sort of come into place here, I just think that the league is in such a great place where you have these, mid-market teams like the Timberwolves and the Pacers, and the Thunder didn't make it to the conference finals this year, but all of these fan bases that are absolutely electric in these playoff atmospheres. We see the Pacers are undefeated at home so far through the postseason. All of these fan bases step up in a big way, and I think that, all of them still have marketable stars that make it not make it to the point where if the finals were to hypothetically be the Timberwolves and the Pacers, it wouldn't get great ratings probably, but I think if you're an NBA fan, there's still a lot that you can look forward to from a star standpoint. And we're going to get more tomorrow into the different types of matchups we could see in the finals and what types of storylines would be the most compelling. So I don't want to dive too much into that right now. But again, I think that all of these options are a lot of fun, and we're just seeing the NBA sort of transition into this next generation right before our eyes, where we sort of knew it was going on. Obviously, at the All-Star break, we had the conversations around who is going to be the next face of the NBA, and it at times maybe felt a little bit forced, but here we are now in May, and I think that whoever wins the finals this year has a great chance of taking home that face of the NBA, look, because it kind of starts with titles. Obviously, you got to have the talent, and the regular season accolades sort of come into play as well. But at the end of the day, it's about winning. And I think that Jason Tatum, Anthony Edwards, Luka Doncic, no offense to Pacers fans, I think they are probably a tier ahead of the Pacers and Tyrese Halliburton. And, I don't think that the Pacers necessarily, they have some very long odds as things currently stand. We're going to get, again, more into the previews tomorrow, but I know the Celtics, as things currently stand, according to DraftKings, are something like minus 900 favorites to beat the Pacers in the Eastern Conference Finals. So, I think that Pacers fans can definitely understand that this is just something that is fun to celebrate at this moment, but in the long run, they can definitely be a prominent team. But again, just seeing all of these players carry their teams to wins and do so, and I think the different sort of skill sets that come with each and every one of these players. Again, I know I mentioned they're eliminated, but Shai Gilgeous-Alexander for Oklahoma City, his sort of mid-range style, playing good defense, and being more of a score-first point guard, but does still have that playmaking ability when his team can actually show up. Luka Doncic, just a pure scorer, sort of like that James Harden level scorer that we saw for all those years as well. Anthony Edwards and Jason Tatum, I do think there's a lot of similarities in their game. The ability to sort of slash and impact the game as well when they are not scoring quite as much. I think that Edwards has shown a lot of shades that remind me of Tatum during this playoff run as well. All of it's just really exciting to see. And it's not going to stop there with just who we are, currently watching, where I don't think that any of those names that I just mentioned are necessarily going to be able to pull off any type of a big, I'm not saying they can't make a playoff run, but to the, gravity of what we're seeing from some of these other young players and in comparison to what they've done their entire careers, I think we're just sort of past that point, and we're only going to see more of these young players step up. Victor Wembanyama, for whenever he gets a competitive team around him, I expect him to be in that conversation as well. And the list really goes on for all this young talent, and I think it's really exciting to sort of monitor how this plays out. But let me know your thoughts on this next generation of the NBA. That is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Be sure to follow us on social media for more exclusive short content as well. We are live every 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern, so we will be back tomorrow. We will see you then. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that